Hello, everyone. We're just getting there's people rolling in right now on Zoom, but we want to welcome you to this next second day of our communication access series. And it's our session presenter is going to be Megan again today from Disability Rights California. Megan, do you want to, or actually, I think we'll have Lorna go first to talk about the Spanish translation. Can you speak to us, Lorna? And then for those of us who are English speaking, please know that at the bottom of your screen, you're going to see the option to pick a language. And if you're not of Spanish speaking, then please pick English. That this allows us to offer the interpretation and keep everything in sync. So go down to the bottom of your screen, choose language, click English if you are English speaking. All right, Megan, are you ready? Megan, you may be muted.
Sorry, yeah, give me just a moment here.
No worries.
While I'm getting situated, Ray, do you want to drop the handouts in the chat for everybody, just in case it's the same document as last week, but for anyone who wasn't here or can't find it or whatever other reason folks might need it.
And I'm Darlene. I'll just talk for a second then. I'm Darlene Hansen, and I am the chair or the director of communication for Disability Voices United. And together with Disability Rights California, we are presenting this series. Today's day 2. If you weren't here last week, there is a recording on our YouTube channel, Disability Voices United YouTube channel. And we will be sending out the links after today's, I believe Ed said. We'll send out the links to the previous 2. Eventually, you'll have all 3 links to the recordings. So those will be made available for yourself or for others to view. This webinar series is hosted as, I should say sponsored or brought to you by Ability Central, who is a philanthropy group in California who are very grateful for their support to get a lot of the work done that we do around communication in California. They are big, that's their thing, is to advocate for communication. So this series is brought to us by them.
All right, thanks, Darlene. I think I'm all situated. Sorry for the fast flipping their slides. So if you are following along on the handout, which you don't have to do, but if that helps you, we're gonna start right about at slide 20. So last week we got through most of what we had planned to get through, but we're gonna go back and hit a couple points that we didn't get to last week, and then we'll move on to what was planned for today. So just a reminder before we do that, if folks have questions, ideally, if it works for you, you can type them in the chat. If it works better for you, you can raise your hand and then we'll call on you. Either way, we'll pause for questions when there are kind of natural breaking points. So feel free to throw your question in the chat and don't worry that we've forgotten it. We're probably just getting ready to come back to it when we have a good stopping point. If people want to save questions for the end, you can, but you don't have to. And just a reminder, just like last week, if you have general questions that will help you and maybe other people on the call understand the material we're talking about, those are great questions to ask on on this call. If you have a question that's more specific to your personal situation, particularly one where you'd have to share, a lot of information about your life to really give context to the question, that's a good sign that what you might actually want to do instead is sign up to do an intake with Disability Rights California, so that we can follow up with you individually and see if we can give you some advice about your particular situation. So just like that last week, Ray will drop the link to the sign up sheet into the chat. And if you sign up, we will try to get back to you within about a week, hopefully before we meet again. And again, if you have something more urgent, you can always call our 800 number instead. So with that, let's get back to where we left off last week. So we talked about how to get communication supports in a variety of different specific situations. And we just finished talking about college, which segues nicely into talking about how to get communication supports from the Department of Rehabilitation. So DOR, for anybody who hasn't dealt with them before or isn't familiar with them, is a state agency that provides services to people with disabilities to help people achieve their employment goals. So just like with the other areas we've talked about, we're going to have some magic words, which is what I call them when we throw a little bit of legalese at you, right? Mostly we can use plain language to talk about things, but once in a while it's helpful to know the key phrases that are in the law. So that's where you see the little magic rabbit popping out of the hat there. So in DOR world, some of our key words are rehabilitation technology. So if you needed, for example, software or a device to allow you to communicate, DOR would probably call that rehabilitation technology. And DOR provides rehab technology when someone needs it either to achieve their employment goal or to access their other DOR services to achieve their employment goal. It's all driven by your employment goal, what you want to do when you grow up that you've agreed to with DOR. So this connects to college, which is the last thing we talked about last week, in the sense that there may be times where someone is going to college for a degree that they need to go into their preferred career. And they've asked the college for something as a reasonable accommodation, and the college says, we don't have that, or we can't provide that. That's out of the scope of what we do as an accommodation. And we talked last week about how to fight that if you disagree, but another avenue for getting it if you think maybe the college is right, maybe that's a reasonable response, I'm just going to try to get this from somebody else. Sometimes that's where DOR comes in, because if you need it in order to access your college education in order to achieve your employment goal, then DOR can provide it. So how to ask for things from DOR. So kind of like in special ed land where we have a plan and goals, in the DOR world, you have an individualized plan for employment, an IPE, not to be confused with an IEP, although they have some things in common. So just like in other systems, you usually will have a meeting with your rehabilitation counselor and talk about what you need and ask them to add it to your IPE. DOR can do assessments if you need an assessment done to identify what exactly the right communication support is. And sometimes that can be helpful because we talked a little bit last week about how in college, unlike in special ed, the college itself is probably not going to do an assessment to figure out what you need or to show that you have a disability. And so if you can't get that assessment anywhere else, DOR may be able to do that assessment, which may then help you be able to ask the college for what you need or confidently tell them what you need to communicate. All right, so what if they say no or they don't follow through? So with most of the areas we're talking about, these are sort of two separate things, right? There's what you do if they say no, and then there's what you do if they said yes, but then they didn't follow through. In DOR land, it's all one path to deal with both of those situations. And you can start anywhere along that path that you want to. So you can take it step by step, or you can jump to the end if you prefer. So, we very often encourage people to consider at least trying to resolve things at the lowest level, because it can get things done faster and save you a lot of grief. And then you can always go up the chain to more formal processes if that doesn't work. So if you're wanting to do that at DOR, your first step is to talk to the team manager. That's your counselor's direct supervisor. And that's pretty informal, right? That can be an email saying, hey, I'm having this problem. Can I talk to you? If you can't get things straightened out with the team manager, you can do the lowest level of appeal. And as appeals go, it's very informal and very fast. So it's called an administrative review. And it's up one level from the team manager. You submit an administrative review request to the district administrator. And it doesn't have to be fancy. Again, it can be a letter or an email that says, I'm requesting an administrative review. Here's the problem I'm having, or here's what I disagree with DOR about. And they have to give you a written decision within 15 days. So that's pretty quick. It's not always fast enough, but it's a lot faster than going to a hearing usually is. So if you then get the administrative review decision back and you still disagree, you have the right to request a mediation and or a hearing. Or, like we said, you can skip over the team manager, you can skip over the administrative review and go straight to a hearing if you want to. But hearings are more work to prepare for, and they're more formal and they take more time. All right, why don't I pause just for DOR related questions before we move on?
Yes, there is one in the chat. So it says 10 years ago in San Diego, 10 years ago, DOR in San Diego could not understand Jeremy's needs. I assume that's your adult child, and referred us to a sheltered workshop. It seemed they had never seen anyone like Jeremy, so we decided to use our energy in other ways regarding employment goals. Do you know if DOR has improved over 10 years in terms of their knowledge? Have you heard anything regarding San Diego? Thank you.
So this is a great opportunity for me to tell you about a program that Disability Rights California has called the Client Assistance Program, or CAP. So we have a whole team of advocates whose whole job is to help people with problems or disputes with DOR. And our CAP advocates each serve a different region of the state. So one of the advantages of that is they really get to know their local offices and often know, who to talk to solve a problem or what patterns of problems they're seeing in those offices. So what I would say is that DOR, like a lot of other agencies, has its problems, right? They have their patterns of decisions that we disagree with and that we see causing problems for our clients. And so, if you get DOR telling you that you're not eligible, or acting like they have no idea what you're talking about, or acting like they don't know how to work with someone like you, that's a great time to call our intake line to speak with our CAP program and see if we can give you some guidance about what DOR should be doing and about your rights. It's certainly not uncommon to see DOR not do a great job of handling situations where the client has a developmental disability. We've seen some, sort of referring people back to the regional center when instead they should be serving them, those kinds of things. So unfortunately, it does happen. I can't say for sure whether it's gotten better, but I will say that DRC has now had the CAP program for several years, and we've gotten better at figuring out how to help people navigate that. So, if you're dealing with that, that would be a great thing to call us about. Or if you have an issue today, you can fill out the intake form. But again, if DOR is saying something that you disagree with, you have things you can do about that, right? You can go to the team manager, you can request an administrative review. So just like in all these other areas we've talked about, you don't have to accept that terrible answer at face value. You do have recourse, but I know it can be very frustrating dealing with all of these systems. So thank you for that question.
So I see, thank you, Ed, for putting client assistant program link in the chat. Next question. Can you have a job if you're 18 in a transition program, also needs help with hygiene needs related to the bathroom?
That is an awesome question. That's a little bit outside of the scope of today's talk. So I would recommend that you fill out the intake form. We'd love to talk with you one-on-one about that for your particular situation.
Okay, there's a comment about blind field services. It's not a question, so I'm gonna go past that at the moment. Next one, my mom called DOR about signing me up for a program that only took DOR referral, and DOR told her to call the regional center.
Yeah, so that's an example of what we were just talking about, right? Where DOR doesn't always respond appropriately when they know someone is a regional center client, which is not okay. And it's a practice we're working on getting under control. So we'd love to hear from folks when that happens, partly so we can give you advice, and also partly so that we can keep tracking these issues and make sure that we're following up with DOR about the patterns we're seeing, and reminding them that something is still a problem and they still need to work on it. So thank you for sharing that.
And I see someone asking about the let's see, oops, the intake form. I'll paste it in the chat again, and you can just click on the link and sign up.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. All right, well, folks are doing that. I think I'll move on, and then if we have any lingering DOR questions, we can always come back to them. So let's assume that we've conquered all our challenges with DOR, we've gotten the services we needed, and now we're ready for work, which is the whole point of DOR services, right? So let's talk about getting communication supports from employers. So our magic words in the world of work are reasonable accommodations. Those are the most important magic words. So like we've seen in some other settings, this is a disability discrimination framework. And some additional magic words for the world of work are interactive process. So this is just fancy language for when you ask your employer for a reasonable accommodation, they're not supposed to just say no, right? They're supposed to engage in a discussion with you, and it should be a back and forth. So, we've talked a little bit in a more general way about, thinking about when to stand our ground and say only this one thing will meet my needs, and when to be open and negotiate. This is a great setting to be open and negotiate in, and the employer should be expecting to do that too. So one of the things you may want to do, in fact, when making a written request for a reasonable accommodation, is to signal to the employer that you know that this is a thing, right? By saying, here's the reasonable accommodation I'm asking for, but I look forward to engaging in an interactive process with you, because it reminds them that they shouldn't just throw up their hands and say, we don't know how to do that, right? They should talk with you and see if you can work through a solution together. So the most obvious kind of person who would get a reasonable accommodation from a workplace is an employee, right? But first, let's talk about getting there, right? So some people will need reasonable accommodations, including communication supports, just to get through the application process, right? If I need an ASL interpreter for the interview, I'm not going to wait until I'm hired to ask for that accommodation, because it'll be too late, right? I already will have failed to answer their questions at the interview. So applicants can ask for accommodations they need for the interview or application process. And then once you're hired, employees are entitled to reasonable accommodations if with those accommodations, with or without them, they're able to perform the essential functions of the job. So basically the protection that this provides employers is, if I somehow manage to apply for a job as a doctor and sneak through the process and get a job offer without them realizing that I haven't gone to medical school, right? And I'm not qualified to be a doctor, and I also need accommodations because of my disability, they don't have to keep me around and try to accommodate with my disability. I'm not qualified for the job. they can fire me, right? They're not firing me because of my disability. They're firing me because I'm not qualified for the job. So that's sort of a common sense protection, right? And I don't think any of you are going to be out applying for jobs you aren't qualified for. I'm sure we all want jobs that are a good fit. So something a lot of people kind of struggle with is when in the process to ask for reasonable accommodations, because that kind of comes along with disclosing the fact that you have a disability. And you know, some disabilities are going to be obvious to the employer early in the process and some are not. And so often people call DRC and ask about, do I have to tell them I have a disability? When should I tell them that I have a disability? How much detail do I have to share? So it really depends on when you need accommodations. You have no obligation to tell an employer that you have a disability unless and until you need to ask for accommodations. You may choose to, and that's of course your choice, but you don't have to go into the interview and say, just so you know, I have this disability, right? You can wait until you're hired and reach a point, whatever point in the process where you realize, oh, I think I'm going to need an accommodation to be successful at this job. And then you can ask for it at that time. You don't ever have to tell your employer what your diagnosis is. Practically speaking, a lot of people do because it's just easier to have all the information out on the table and we all understand what we're talking about. But when you're asking for accommodations, if you would like to maintain some privacy, you can have your doctor write a note supporting your accommodation request that says you have a disability and because of that disability, you need this reasonable accommodation. It doesn't have to say what your diagnosis is. All right, so when can employers say no? So we already talked about the situation where you're not qualified for the job, right? They don't have to keep you around and accommodate you. But they can also say no if the accommodation would be an undue burden. So that basically means too expensive or too hard to do. And whether a particular accommodation is too expensive or too hard for that employer depends on the whole situation, right? So an accommodation, the exact same accommodation requested from a little tiny employer with not a lot of resources might be unreasonable in that situation. But if you work for Bank of America that has lots of resources, that same accommodation might be reasonable. So I think generally it's good to just go ahead and ask for what you think you need and be clear that you're open to the interactive process. The worst they can say is no, or we need to figure out a cheaper way and let's work together, right? It doesn't hurt to ask. And it's illegal for an employer to retaliate against you for requesting accommodations by firing you, demoting you, et cetera. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it is against the law. All right, so options once they do say no. So before we dive into, what your legal options are, just like with everything else, it's good to stop and think, okay, what's the least extreme way I can try to fix this? And then you don't have to do that, but it's an option and it might save some grief. And I think in the world of work, it's really hard to file a formal complaint against your employer and then go back to work every day and have an ongoing relationship with that employer. It's just, it's certainly you're right, but it can be awkward. And so if you can resolve it in a less confrontational way, you might want to consider that, right? So for example, if you're, the only person you've talked to, the person who said no is your direct supervisor, and your company's big enough that they have an HR department, it might be worth contacting HR to make sure they even knew that your boss said no, right? Because they may be more aware of their legal obligations and of how to make accommodations work, right? I work at Disability Rights California, which has got to be one of the most disability friendly employers that there is. But we still encourage people to talk to HR when they are asking for accommodations because they have the expertise in, in making accommodations work for people and what they've done in the past in similar situations that might be a good idea this time, those kinds of things. So if you can't work things out more informally with your employer and you do want to file a complaint, you have a couple options for where to file. What it's called depends on which agency you're filing with. Don't worry about that too much, but it could be called a charge or a complaint, depending on the agency. So you can file with the EEOC, which is a federal agency, or with DFEH, which is the California agency, and both have pretty long timelines. Obviously, if you're trying to get the problem sorted out so you can do your job, you're going to want to file way sooner than that, right? Just to get it solved. So let me just pause there. I think I see Ryan has a hand up. I don't know if we have any other questions.
There are a lot of questions, questions and comments in the chat, but whoever raised their hand, you can go ahead while I go through the chat.
And I think last week Ryan ended up choosing to type his question in the chat. So
Yeah,
if that's what he wants to do.
Ryan's been talking in the chat. I don't know if you want to still ask it again, Ryan, or are we answering it in the chat? I'm gonna, here.
Yeah.
Have we been answering it in the chat for you, Ryan?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, that's probably easiest, huh?
Great.
Okay, so let me see here. So I'm just gonna kind of go summarize. Looks like Ryan, he actually signed up for the intake sheet last time and says that someone left him a message and gonna email him, but hasn't got an email. This looks like someone provided some history on the DOR, and then mentioned that regional center is the player of last resort, and saying that DOR will push you to the regional center. Next, I would like to know where we stand with communication support. We passed historic legislation in New York and looking to bring to California. This is because people with a communication disability will need communication support to ask for communication support. My request has been denied repeatedly and was a barrier to due process. What do you do when the judge allows DOR to proceed with the evidence packet if they did not provide in accessible format? This happened seven times in 5 years.
Gosh, okay. So that sounds like a very specific situation that's probably also fairly complicated. So if that's still an ongoing issue that you want to talk with CAP about, I would encourage you to fill out the intake form and we can get back to you and get into the details.
I can
So
put it in the chat
sounds
again.
messy and difficult.
And then next, I'm trying to prepare myself and my son as he's getting. I'm sorry. Let me go back. I'm trying to prepare myself and my son as to what he's getting and what's denied. There are things he'll need for future work. He's been denied counseling, therapy because school isn't qualified for my son's type of disability. He has Down syndrome. They're also denying any kind of device that he needs or that has helped in previous school.
Okay. And I'm not sure if the person who typed that question was here last week when we talked about school, but I believe the recording of that session should be available. Darlene, do you know if it's up yet on the website?
It's up on our YouTube channel, Disability
Oh, great.
Voices United YouTube channel, but we haven't sent out the link in the email blast. But if you go to the YouTube channel, you should be able to find it.
Great. And then if that's kind of a way to get the lay of the land. And then if you still have questions, we'd be happy to do an intake about the particular situation. So.
And next question, I think it's talking about the reasonable accommodation. They ask, how does one determine reasonable?
Yeah, so that takes into account your needs and then also whether whatever it is, all the factors that affect whether whatever it is would be an undue burden for, I assume we're talking about the work context for the employer. So if it's something, if it's a very small company with not a lot of money and it's something very, very expensive, that could be an undue burden. If it's something that kind of prevents them from doing business the way they normally would do it and interferes with their ability to make money, right? That could potentially be an undue burden. It's hard to imagine a communication support that would do that, but those are the kinds of things that employers can say no to. And again, the exact same support. So let's say what I need is an ASL interpreter for team meetings, right? So that might be, no big deal to a very large company, and it's going to be more of a burden to a little tiny company. That doesn't mean it's for sure an undue burden, right? But the analysis is going to be different depending on the resources that the company has, and of course, how much the thing costs or how hard it is to do. So, and that's where, going in with an idea of what's worked for you in the past, but also a willingness to kind of have a back and forth conversation with the employer and try to find something that works for you and works for them is a really good thing to do, since they're supposed to engage in an interactive process with you.
And then this one comment is the same person who said they had the same issue 7 times in 5 years. This is directed towards regarding CAP.
More. Mhm.
And this person said the CAP has refused to take my case. I'm sorry, quote, I'm sorry we do not have the resources to represent you.
That does happen sometimes, right? We do have limited resources. And if you have, anybody who disagrees with the decision DRC makes about how we're able to help in your case has a right to file a grievance. You have that option. But also, if there are new developments, you're still welcome to call CAP and do a new intake, because the way CAP program works is very one step at a time, right? So we typically provide people the advice or the information they need at the stage that they're at when they contact us. But it's a long journey with DOR, right? And sometimes you go and follow that advice, but then you get stuck again. So we have lots of people who call us back more than once, and we're happy to talk with people again and help them with those next steps at that next stage. So, all right, so I think I'm going to move on just in the interest of time. So that covers what we intended to cover last week. So now we're back on track. So we're going to kind of breeze through some of this refresher stuff since we're already warmed up, and then we're going to talk about a couple more specific situations where you can request communication supports, businesses, and when you're dealing with government agencies. And then we'll talk about a couple of sources of communication supports you use everywhere: insurance, medical insurance, and the regional center. And if we have time, we'll talk through some practice scenarios to kind of help reinforce all of what we've gone over. All right, so we'll do a quick little pop quiz just to see what we remember from last week. So feel free to type your answers in the chat, and I say cheating is allowed if you want to refer to the handout, no judgment. All right. So, do employers ever have to provide a communication support to somebody they haven't hired yet? This is not too hard because it's only been about 5 minutes. And Ray, if you could read out the answers as people type them in the chat.
So far, I see one yes, one no.
Yes.
More yes and more no's. Looks pretty even so far. Yes for the interview.
Excellent. Yes, for the application process, if you need supports to get through that process, you can ask for those as accommodations right up front. Very good. All right, one more question. If the school district won't add a communication support to my IEP, is there anything I can do about that, or am I just stuck? And if you can think of what maybe I could do about it, you get bonus points if you type that in the chat.
We got a yes so far. And another yes. More yeses. Yes, fair hearing.
Great.
Yes, ask for amendment meeting and bring an expert. There's one that says file a complaint. Yes, you can email the team manager or the, and then I think they're still typing. Oh, that's Veha.
All right, great. So in special ed land, due process is my option for how to go to a hearing and get a judge to decide, right? And another tool we talked about quite a bit last week, if I disagree with the assessment that the school district is relying on to make their decision, I can request an independent educational evaluation, or an IEE, right? Great job, everybody. You all pass. All right, so let's move on and talk about getting communication supports from businesses. So first, think about what are some businesses you get services from or patronize regularly. Put your favorite one in the chat and Ray will read them out. I know I'm making you guys actually participate a lot here, and it's late in the day. I don't know if anybody's on team should have had one more cup of coffee with me, but if that's where you are, I feel ya. All right, do we have any businesses in the chat?
These are good ones. Restaurants, Target, Amazon, Uber.
Sorry,
grocery
I was
store,
reading and I was muted. I didn't realize.
Sorry, Ray.
medical transport. That's all right. I'll jump in. Doctors.
Awesome.
CVS.
CVS, specialty pharmacy. Yeah.
Great, y'all are on the right track. So places that might be businesses include your doctor's office, hotels, airlines, movie
Oh,
theaters,
DMV.
gyms. Lots of places that we, use to have fun, to get things we really need, right? So it touches, businesses touch a lot of parts of our lives. So it's really important that we know how to get communication supports from them because it's no small part of life in America these days, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit about your rights to communication supports when you're dealing with businesses. So our magic words are auxiliary aids and services, which is just a fancy way of saying communication supports, right? We've talked about communication supports are basically things and people that help you communicate. And that's the aids and services, right? And what you're entitled to is for the business to make sure you are able to have effective communication. And just like what is an undue burden depends on all the circumstances. What constitutes, what counts as effective communication depends on some different factors. So obviously it depends partly on your needs, right? What kind of communication supports work for you so you can understand and be understood. It also depends on the nature and complexity of the communication, right? So if it's very brief and simple, a communication support might work that is not going to work for a long, complicated conversation. So the complexity and importance of the information matters too. So another factor that comes up occasionally is whether it's an emergency, right? So we don't expect a business to have as perfect a communication support lined up when they have to, figure it out kind of in a hurry as we would expect if they have more notice and time to get it arranged. Okay. So they can say no if providing it would be cause a fundamental alteration of what they do. Basically, you're asking them to do something that's just like not even what they're about, right? So you're asking them to do something that is not the kind of business they are. And I highly doubt any of you will be asking for anything that's a fundamental alteration, right? Or they can say no if it's an undue burden. So again, it may depend on how expensive that thing is or how hard it is to arrange and things like how big and resourced of a business are we talking about, right? So a lot of the businesses you all put in the chat are big companies that have a lot of resources. And so paying for the occasional thing that's pretty expensive isn't actually that burdensome for those kinds of companies. All right, so here's an example to kind of bring that to life. So Jay is deaf and he goes to the pharmacy at Walgreens, probably to pick up a prescription, I would guess. And Walgreens provides an ASL interpreter, not live and in person, but on a computer screen, right? So like a video call, right? So do you think that's going to provide Jay with effective communication? How would we know? So it would depend partly on whether that works for him, right? So if he can see the screen clearly and the interpreter can see him, and so his questions to the pharmacist get interpreted correctly, the pharmacist's, advice to him gets interpreted correctly, then it works and that's effective, right? We could see a situation where that video screen might not work for someone, right? So if Jay also has some vision impairment and the screen is tiny, that might not work for him because he might not be able to see the person well enough to understand the signing, right? So in that situation, maybe a person would ask for an in-person interpreter, right? Or some other communication support that works better for them. So can Walgreens say no if he asks for ASL interpretation? How do we know, right? So if this were so expensive that it was going to bankrupt Walgreens, right, which is a very big company, they could say no, but we're not too worried about that happening, right? Or if it asked them to fundamentally alter what they do, right? Shut down the whole pharmacy, serve no other customers that day and serve just J, which we're also not too worried about, right? If all he's asking for is effective interpretation. Now, what if instead of going to Walgreens, Jay went to his little corner pharmacy that's a little mom and pop operation and doesn't have a lot of money? Is it more likely then that it might be an undue burden for them to provide ASL interpretation? Right? I'm not saying that it would be an undue burden. It just would be more likely, right? It's still not that expensive of an accommodation. They're not, having to hire a person full time, right? They need them probably for a short time to answer his questions. But, the size of the business is going to matter in deciding what's an undue burden. So let's say now that Jay went into Walgreens, but it wasn't to pick up a prescription or anything where he needs a lot of, information about the side effects, right? He just wants to ask a clerk which aisle the toilet paper's on, right? So is it possible that, if let's say the clerk asks him to write down the question on a piece of paper and then points to the aisle where the toilet paper is that effective communication for that situation? Maybe, right? You can see how you're much more likely to need ASL interpretation for that communication with the pharmacist because it's really important medical information we're talking about. We need to know how to take the medicine right so we don't get sick, right? Versus just pointing you to where something is in the store. That's a pretty simple, brief interaction. So maybe that quick little solution was good enough and was effective communication for that situation, right? So we look at all the circumstances to figure out what is good enough to be effective communication. All right, so what if you ask a business for a communication support and they say no? So like all these other situations, you can file complaints, right? But we also want to think about what are simple things we can do that are easy that might get it resolved quickly. So if the only person you've talked to about it is the pharmacist or the cashier, maybe you want to talk to a manager who has a little more authority and might know what they should be doing, right? If you do decide to file complaints, you can file with the Department of Justice, that's a federal agency, or with DFEH, that's a state agency. For DOJ, I don't have a timeline on there because there is no deadline, but you don't want to wait a long time because it's a lot easier to prove your case if you file soon because the agency that's investigating may need to talk to people who were there who, if you wait 3 years, they will have forgotten or they might not be able to find them, right? It's easier to get your evidence together when you file soon. So those are your legal options for filing a complaint. And of course, as we've talked about, we all pick our battles in life to some extent, right? And filing a complaint every time somebody screws up is a lot of work, right? But what are other things you can do when you think a business didn't handle something very well, right? Are there any other ways to maybe put some pressure on them to do the right thing that you don't have to be a lawyer to know about? Any ideas? Want to type them in the chat?
Let's see, it says, yes, you can inform them that you are recording and then go public on social media, boycott the business, mute the store manager, Yelp review.
Yelp review, that's a great one, right? That's something everybody has access to, right? My word of caution about recording is that it is illegal in California to record someone without their consent. So just don't want you to get into a pickle there. I mean, if you tell someone you're recording and they continue to talk, that's consent, but you don't want to be secretly recording people and get into a bad situation there. But yeah, Yelp reviews, voting with your dollars, right? Take your business elsewhere where you're treated better. Those are all options. You can file a complaint with the Better Business Bureau. That's not a, they don't have a lot of legal authority, but for their members, they like to have them handle customer service problems and get them sorted out. So yeah, that's great. Those are all great ideas for how you can put some pressure on a business to do the right thing without being, without finding yourself filing DFEH complaints every week. So thanks, everybody. All right, shall we pause here and talk about any questions about businesses before we move on to talking about government agencies?
Let me scroll all the way back up. I think there was some questions about self-employment, DOR. I pointed them to a publication. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add to that, Megan. They basically ask if DOR can help with self-employment.
Yeah, the publication is great. And then if you still have questions, feel free to give us a call and do an intake.
Okay, I think here's one. It's kind of long. Give me 1 second. The question is, my audiologist said to ask for flashcards during road tests. I cannot find any driving school that offers that. DMV claims there are no accommodations for a road test. How do deaf people have a road test if they are forced to look sideways for communication signs while also keeping eyes on the road? Deaf Community Service, DCS, they never heard of this. I desperately need this for August 20th, my hearing on this matter.
All right, well, that is a great segue into our next topic. So we've been talking about businesses, and next we're going to talk about government agencies. So I don't know that it will answer all your specific questions, but this should get you a little closer. And then if you still have specific questions, you may want to fill out the intake form so we can get into the details with you. All right, so government agencies, right? And we're gonna try to kind of put the government agencies we deal with in our day-to-day life into two buckets. So one is the bucket for state and local government agencies. That's things like your local police department, your library, state parks, your city parks, recreation centers, lots of things that we deal with in our day-to-day lives. And then there are federal government agencies, right? The post office, the TSA, when you're flying at the airport, if you're at a national park, those are all involve federal agencies. So the DMV is a great example of a state and local government agency. And part of the reason it matters, so your right to reasonable accommodations is very similar with these two categories, but where it matters is when we get to talking about your options for filing complaints. So we'll get to that in a slide or two. All right, so whether it's a federal or a state or local government agency, just like with businesses, you have a right to communication supports, right? Auxiliary aids and services, so that you can have effective communication. And with government agencies, generally, they should be providing the particular communication support you ask for, because we assume you're the expert on your needs, which is good, right? Unless that particular support would be an undue burden, again, here's that language again, or it would require a fundamental alteration of what that agency does, or unless that agency can show that they're offering you something else that they prefer that would work just as well, that would give you just as good of communication access. All right, so what if they say no? So just like we've talked about in some other settings, even though government agencies are a little more bureaucratic than some of the other kinds of things we've talked about, there still are supervisors you can talk to sometimes, right? Sometimes just asking questions and trying to negotiate can help you get to a solution sort of informally. And if that fails, you can file discrimination complaints, you can file lawsuits. Lawsuits have been kind of the unspoken option in all these categories. And the reason we haven't spent much time on that is I know that you all have very busy lives and are probably not looking to file lawsuits everywhere you turn, right? But the reason I just want to bring it up when it comes to government agencies is that if you get to that point where you feel like it's worth filing a lawsuit, there are much shorter deadlines sometimes to take action, and you would want to look into that right away and talk to a personal injury attorney. We're not going to get into a ton of details right now, but you usually have to file something called a tort claim or a government claim, and there's a short deadline for that. Much unfairly, the government has some protection against getting sued that businesses don't. So you just want to make sure that if you're wanting to go down that road, that you look into it right away and talk to an attorney. So, all right, so a little more detail about discrimination complaints. So if the agency that you're filing a complaint against is a state or local government agency, you can file at the federal level with the Department of Justice, or you can file at the state level with DFEH. Again, DFEH's name is a little bit misleading. They do more things than their name suggests. And if your dispute is with a federal government agency, those agencies are all supposed to have their own internal complaint processes, which makes it a little harder to find where to file. With some federal agencies, you can find that information pretty easily by poking around on their website. With others, it's less clear. So if you were trying to find that person with that federal agency or that office that you would complain to, you would want to look on their website, and if you still can't find it, maybe just call them up and say, I'm looking for, your person or office that handles discrimination complaints. They might call that person like a 504 officer or something like that. But again, you should be able to just say in your own words what you're looking for and get hopefully routed to the right place. So the deadlines for this are a little bit complicated, and we don't have time to go into that today, but the bottom line is you would want to do it promptly so you don't miss a deadline. All right, so any questions about complaints and communication supports with government agencies?
There are a few questions that are going back a little bit back to with businesses, if you're okay with
Sure,
answering
yeah,
those.
absolutely.
Some large organizations such as Walgreens have interpreters assist people in other languages, but not ASL, and say to simply ask, how can it be added at the corporate level?
Well, so what your legal right is to reasonable accommodations. And unfortunately, to get a reasonable accommodation, you do have to ask, right? I think, companies tend to have more ready solutions for things that come up the most often. So I'm sure there are some languages they have, for Spanish, for example, they may have somebody in the building who speaks Spanish who can just come right up and talk to you. And for slightly less common, languages, they get somebody on the phone. And then the really uncommon languages, they might not know what to do, right? So, your legal right is to ask for a reasonable accommodation and then have them provided upon request. I would love to see some changes in the law that make some things a little bit more automatic, but it's not the framework we're dealing with, at this time. So I think sometimes we fight our battles on more than one front kind of simultaneously, right? We know what our rights are now and we work within that framework, and we also work to change the framework, right, at the same time, because you got to live your life while you're also, fighting to make the system better for future generations, right? So yeah, it would be great if it was a little more automatic. So I would settle for businesses just realizing that they have a legal obligation to provide reasonable accommodations when they're requested, right? That would be progress with a lot of places, unfortunately. So.
Okay, next one. Excuse me. Does requesting a caregiver to participate or be present during interaction with police or other government agency qualified as auxiliary aid and services? Does DRC provide help about interaction with police or other social service agencies?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because interactions with the police are so high stakes and so important, and we've seen such high profile examples of that going wrong in recent years. And we know it's been the case all along, but the fact that so many incidents are recorded on cell phones today is how the reason that people are becoming more aware. So the police department, like any other agency, needs to provide reasonable accommodations. And, it's good to ask for whatever you think makes sense for you. So you might ask for, hey, can my family member help me with this interaction, help me make myself understood? The advantage of that for them, if they cooperate and give you that accommodation, is it doesn't even cost them anything, right? Conceivably, there could be times where the police department thinks that that's not appropriate because they don't think it's safe for that family member to be there. Police respond obviously to all kinds of different situations, where they might want to bring in their own interpreter, right, and pay for it, or their own, person to provide the support. I think your job as the person who needs the accommodation is to ask for what you think makes sense. And then if they counter with, oh, we can do this for you instead, that's the point at which you figure out, okay, is what they're offering going to work for me? And do I say, okay, fine? Or do I say, oh, I really need this and here's why, right? And clarify for them why that won't work for you. I know there are a lot of folks who have, who really need somebody who knows them very well to provide communication support. And, if that's the only option that will work for you, you should tell them. Interactions with the police are things that very often unfold really quickly, and people aren't stopping to really think these things through like they should, right? The police department isn't doing that. Training for police is such a huge need, and DRC is certainly looking at how we can best help with the kind of huge systemic problems there are with the police and how they interact with people with disabilities, and also looking at the intersection of that with how the police interact with people of color. These are really huge problems, and we don't have all the answers, but we do have a team that is recently formed to start working on and looking at those issues. So we certainly want to hear from people who have had problems with the police related to their disability. I can't promise that we will have easy answers, but we certainly want to know. We want to know what's going on. We want to try to help where we can. And the more we hear from the community about what they're experiencing, the better that helps us plan our longer term strategies and see what is needed and what people are wanting from us. So I certainly would encourage you, if you've had that happen, to call us or fill out the intake form to see what we might be able to do. So sorry, that was a very long-winded answer.
Oh, well, Megan, so a theme that's coming through on the threads and was in my head too, is that when we're talking about a communication challenge, to say that you have a communication challenge is part of the barrier, right? So for especially, for any social services, it applies, but also for, in emergency situations with, for example, the police.
Yeah.
That's like a catch-22. If you have the communication difference and challenge,
How do you ask for the?
How do you ask for the appropriate services, or let them know that what they're offering isn't appropriate? That's a big deal, right? And you might not have the answer.
And I don't know that there is, a super easy one size fits all answer. I know that there are people who, carry something with them that's easy to show to someone that sort of like summarizes the situation quickly, right? I have a disability and I'm not able to speak. Here's how I communicate, right? Or please do this, please call this phone number, or please get me an ASL interpreter, or please wait while I type on my device because it takes time, right? If you have a situation that can be, where there are tools like that work well for you, right? A letter that you carry with you, maybe that's, it's hard to write a letter that covers every situation, but that says, I often need reasonable accommodations for my disability. Here's what that need looks like. Here are things that typically help me, right? Some people find it helpful to have something like that. It's not a perfect solution, right? And it doesn't work for everybody. It's certainly, if you have a person who is often with you and supports you, it's certainly fine to have them help you communicate your request. I think when it's an adult who needs the support and another person is speaking on your behalf, the biggest barrier I hear from people about is, oh, they want to hear from me because I'm an adult and this person's not my conservator or whatever that is. And I think very often that barrier can be broken down by just making clear that this is not a person speaking instead of you, it's a person supporting you so you can get your message across, right? You're standing right there next to them nodding as they're saying what you want them to say, right? You're part of that process as opposed to being excluded from it. I think that is really helpful, especially with social service type agencies, that are sensitive to wanting to make sure they're not failing to get permission from a person to do something on their behalf, which is legitimate, right? We don't want them going and acting without your permission. That's really important. But we also don't want that to become an excuse to not help you if you need help asking for things. So, kind of the art of asking for things together instead of asking on someone's behalf without their involvement can really help with that. So, but I agree this is a huge challenge, and I think even in a perfect world where everybody wanted to do the right thing, it would still be a challenge, right? Because people's situations are so different, and what works for people is so different, and that's hard. So, I mean, if you have an individual situation where something that you do that's the best way you have to communicate your request has been ignored or rejected, those would be good examples of things that individually we might be able to talk with you about, and see if we can give you some legal advice about that. But yeah, these are tough issues, and I'm glad you all are asking the tough questions, even when I don't have all the answers, because
Well,
these are things to figure out, aren't they?
I think too, I mean, this goes back to why we're doing this series, right? Is that what we're seeing from people, all of you and others, that having access to communication is a systemic issue. And even though it's such a taken for granted experience to have the ability to communicate, for some reason, our community and our society has kind of, if you don't communicate the same as everybody else, then they don't even talk about it. Like it's an all or nothing experience. And so what we really want to get ourselves activated about is advocating for the fact that communication can't be an afterthought. It has to be in everyone's forefront, that you're, so that the community and our society starts thinking about, well, this person communicates with a device, or this person communicates with sign language, or maybe I can write to this person. But so we as citizens just start thinking about how can we accommodate just naturally for people. That it isn't existing right now. It's a barrier.
Well, and communication is just one facet of kind of a bigger problem of, many generations of people with disability not being visible and a part of things, right? And we've made a lot of progress, but there's so far still to go. And, all of you are on the front lines of that. And I, want to make sure we recognize that it's not an easy place to be. And it's such an important, role you're playing by being a generation of people out there living your lives and navigating these thorny issues, and not apologizing for being there and being a part of things. And change is not fast enough, but it's we've come a long way, and got to keep moving forward. So, and I think it's important to acknowledge that the tool I have as an attorney is the law, right? And there's an expression that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? All the solutions don't all come from one from one discipline or one avenue. And one of the things DRC is working towards doing better is kind of acknowledging the existence of other tools and other organizations that advocate in other ways, and figuring out how we can come alongside community organizers and other kinds of organizations, other kinds of groups, formal and informal, that are working for change in other ways. And we're still learning and growing too. So anyway, well, we went really big picture on that. Thank you all. I know there may be some lingering questions. I want to make sure we keep moving so we get through all the material.
There's
and-
conversations going on in the thread.
Great.
So
That's
people are
continue your
talking
side
amongst
conversations. No
themselves.
problem. So we've talked about a lot of different settings and how to, specific rights in specific settings. Now we're going to talk about a couple of major sources of communication supports that maybe you take with you everywhere. And kind of the most obvious example of this is, if you need an expensive communication device and you're going to then go use it at work and at school and everywhere you go. So we're going to talk about health insurance as one way to get that paid for, and also about the regional center. So with Medi-Cal, as with any insurance, what they're going to provide you is what's medically necessary. That's your magic term. And Medi-Cal has different medical necessity standards for kids versus adults. So there are a lot of words here, but the bottom line is that it's much easier to meet the kid standard than the adult standard. So if you're somebody who's, on the cusp of adulthood, if you can get them to pay for what you need, to secure an appropriate device that's going to hopefully last you years before you turn 21, that may be an easier battle than after you turn 21. So
wait, who are you saying this from? The school district or the
Medi-Cal? Medi-Cal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
So for children and youth up to age 21, the standard is basically anything that will help to correct or ameliorate, which is not the way we like to talk about, it's not the way enlightened people talk about disability anyway. So these are the hoops we have to jump through, right, to check their boxes, the effects of a disability. So basically, that's a fancy way of saying anything that helps with something that is a need because of a disability, right? So if your disability affects communication and whatever the service or device is helps you with that, that's a pretty easy standard to meet, right? For adults, basically it has to help you not die or be in severe pain, right? And you can see how this is a much more useful standard for things like surgery than it is for things like communication devices, right? This is not a super helpful standard. And so for people who are still in the special ed world and not yet to the point where you're kind of set free in the world and needing to request things from Medi-Cal, I want to point out how useful and important it is to really fully kind of exploit the special ed protections that you have now before you have to go out and possibly get a device from Medi-Cal. So proving that you need a super expensive communication device for medical reasons is really hard if you've never even had the chance to learn how to use a device and figure out which one works for you and practice communicating with it. So the earlier you can start that while you're still in special ed, get the school district to try out different devices, to have you practice in different settings, so that you're really used to expressing your basic physical needs with your communication device, and you're really good at it before you get to the point where, okay, I'm turning 21, I'm aging out of school, I'm gonna have to give back this device the school district bought, and now I want Medi-Cal to buy me one that's similar. Medi-Cal is gonna want you to be able to show that basically you can use this to tell someone when you're seriously ill, when you're in pain, when you're hungry, when you need to go to the bathroom. And for many folks, those are skills that take a long time to develop. Especially if you've gone years not having a device, it takes a while to learn, oh, I have that power, right, to do that with this device and to master those skills. So the more you can have it all figured out what you need before you get to the point where Medi-Cal would be the one paying, the better. So what if they say no? So just as we've learned in every setting, we have some kind of recourse if they say no. So, and there should be links in the handout version of these slides to quite a few publications here if you want to dive deeper. We're not going to spend a ton of time on these things, but if you're in Medi-Cal managed care, which by now most people are, so there's fee-for-service Medi-Cal, which many of you probably had when you were younger, and then there's managed care through some kind of HMO, some kind of company, right? Kaiser, some of the managed care plans are actually run by the counties. It depends where you live, but that's most people's situation now. You have a right to file a grievance with the plan. And that's usually a first step. You also have a right to request what's called an independent medical review, which is a nifty tool for when you and your health plan disagree about what's medically necessary because you think their person who assessed you and tried to figure out what you needed screwed up, right? And the thing that's kind of magical about IMRs is, so you request these through the Department of Managed Healthcare, and then Department of Managed Healthcare goes back to the plan and makes them pay for the IMR. So they get an outside, qualified medical professional to do the assessment, but the plan's going to have to pay for it. That's expensive, right? So sometimes just giving you what you want is cheaper than doing the IMR and then still probably having to pay for what you want. So sometimes this is the point at which the plan gives in and gives you what you want. So it can be a really useful tool. And Department of Managed Healthcare, all in all, we've found to be pretty consumer friendly, pretty interested in helping people. So it's not a perfect process and it doesn't solve the problem every time, but it's a pretty good tool to have kind of in your toolbox. And then you have a right to file for a fair hearing, ultimately. And the deadlines for all these things are a little bit complicated and I didn't want us to get too bogged down. But if you click on the links in the handout, you can read publications that go into more detail about how you do things in a certain order and with certain timelines and how one step leads to another if you're to that point where you think you're going to appeal a denial from Medi-Cal.
Megan, before you go on, Dr. Haney had a remark. She had her hand raised. Do you want to unmute yours? Let's find you. Here we are. Okay, asking to unmute. Why won't it work? Okay, there you go.
Yes, hello, Megan. I just want to correct your record. I am an expert AAC educator. I want to correct your message about hard to learn that you can use AAC to communicate, and also that it takes a long time to discover that. And actually, the major burden of AAC users, based on our research, is the systemic refusal to accept that AAC users are the authors of their own communication. So please address that, because if you go to the pharmacy and you ask for a refill, they will refuse your communication typed or otherwise. And the same thing is with regional center case manager will force verbal communication, and is like verbal communication is prioritized by the state, and that's illegal. So
Yeah.
please explain where you get this information that is hard and long to use AAC when really it's hard and impossible to have justice in the state of California.
Yeah, and I think those are two separate sets of challenges that both exist, right? So I mean, the situation I think I was speaking to is particularly, my background is largely in working with people with very significant cognitive disabilities. And we've seen situations where people, try to get Medi-Cal to pay for a device and the school system has failed them for years. So they have barely had any access to assistive technology or to AAC. And haven't had really the chance to learn to use a device appropriately before they have to go and jump through this hurdle of proving to Medi-Cal that it's medically necessary. So it is a situation we've seen, and that certainly you're absolutely right that getting people to take your communication seriously is a huge challenge too, right? And I know our focus today and last week has been largely on getting various places to pay for things, right? But sometimes you already have the communication support with you and you just need people to listen to you, right? And that's its own huge challenge and could be the topic of another 3-part series, right? To talk about how to address that. I mean, I think there aren't always, we just talked about how legal remedies aren't always the solution to everything, right? I think that there's a huge need to educate people in lots of different fields and professions about what AAC even is and how amazing it is, right? And how effective it is, and how, appropriate etiquette when interacting with someone who uses communication supports. I think if somebody is systematically ignoring someone's communication, in most contexts, you could make a discrimination complaint, because at some point it amounts to discriminating against people who communicate in a different way and don't have any choice, because that's the means of communication they have available to them because of their disability. Whether those those complaints solve everything is another question, right? It's really tough. I think if people have an individual situation where they're, dealing with an agency, particularly that you're going to have to deal with again, right? It's not a passing interaction. And they're completely ignoring you. We'd be happy to do an intake with folks on that, but it's definitely a thorny problem, and I appreciate you raising it, because it certainly is a challenge. You can get everything paid for and then still people ignore you, and that's got to be infuriating. So thank you for raising that. All right, so I want to talk just briefly about private insurance, and I want to preface this by saying that DRC does not do a lot of work with private insurance, not because it isn't important, but just because of our limited resources. We have to sort of focus them in the areas where we are most able to be effective. So we do a lot of work related to Medi-Cal, and we don't do a lot of work related to private insurance. So, if you have a dispute with a private insurance company and you call us to do an intake, we will probably let you know that that's outside of the scope of our practice, which I know is really frustrating to hear. We try to provide referrals to other helpful agencies when we can. But with that said, I want to kind of touch on private insurance a little bit. So one thing that's important to remember is that insurance companies are businesses. We've already talked about your right to be free from discrimination from businesses, and your right to file complaints. So all of that applies to insurance companies if you feel like they're discriminating based on disability. But the most important way to figure out what private insurance does and doesn't have to pay for is to look at your policy and different, it's a contract, right? You're buying a product, or your employer is in some cases, and those products vary. We, make choices about how much to pay in exchange for what kind of, what terms to have in the policy. So co-pays vary, right? Deductibles vary. Policies about what they'll cover vary. And so it's important to go back to your policy if you have private insurance to figure out what they should or shouldn't be paying for, and whether their no is appropriate under your policy. So just like with Medi-Cal managed care plans, if you're in a private managed care plan, you can use the IMR process that we talked briefly about through the Department of Managed Healthcare. And then there's also a separate complaint process through DMHC that's called a consumer complaint. And if you're not even sure which of those to use, you can call DMHC and just ask them. They do try to be pretty consumer friendly. So just like in other areas, we have some options that aren't so much legal tools as just our everyday skills that we have available to us. So if you're, encountering your healthcare provider acting like you don't need something that you're pretty sure you need, it's good to ask questions. You also have a right to a copy of your medical records. And sometimes asking for that and reviewing those will help you realize that there's something incorrect in there that, has been causing providers to make incorrect assumptions about your needs. And sometimes you can get to the bottom of that and get that corrected or clarified. And you can ask for a second opinion, right? If you have a healthcare provider who's being dismissive or doesn't seem to understand what you're saying, you do have a right to see someone else, and sometimes that makes all the difference. But again, I'm not the expert on private insurance, and the help we're able to provide about it is unfortunately fairly limited. So let me pause here. Do we have any kind of Medi-Cal related questions that have come in as we've been talking about this?
Sorry, let me scroll back up. There was sorry about the background noise. There was a question about
Raymond has the cutest puppy, and that's what you're hearing.
Sorry, she's really excited right now. There was a question about how to get Medi-Cal to cover the how to get Medi-Cal to cover it. I am not sure if that was covered, if
Communication
that
device.
answered the question.
It's communication
A
devices.
communication device, yeah. So we'll just go back a slide. So you start, I mean, just practically like where you start asking, you start with usually with your primary care provider to get a referral to any kind of specialist they think needs to be the one to prescribe the device. And with Medi-Cal, when they submit that recommendation or request to get you something, it's called a TAR, which stands for Treatment Authorization Request. So you need to get the right kind of provider to submit a TAR for the specific thing that they think you need. And then the Medi-Cal, if you have fee-for-service Medi-Cal or the managed care plan, then decides yes or no whether to approve that. So that's the process that happens before you get to know, which I kind of skipped over. Thanks for bringing us back to that.
Here's a question. I'm sorry if I might be skipping some questions around. There's other conversation going in the chat as well. This one says, my son has been entirely excluded from his high school because they never provided the AT that the eval determined he needed. They never went past the initial eval regarding communications. Who pays for finding the right AAC? That's a question. My
Yeah,
son also has an acute temporary seizure-like event where he has aphasia, but loses comprehension. We have not found anything to help in the situation, which occur anytime he has acceleration applied. Example, elevator, car, etc.
Okay. All right. So that sounds pretty involved. And in the interest of time, I'm going to suggest that if you want to do an intake, that you fill out the form that Raymond has put in the chat, the link to, and that if you didn't get a chance, if you weren't here for session 1 last week, that you watch the recording of it. And then if we have, we'll probably see how next week goes. Folks are welcome to come back and you'll hear some real life examples of how this all plays out, which may be helpful. And then we may have some time for more in-depth discussion. That would be a great one for us to discuss then. So, all right. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. We will try to get back to everybody's questions in one form or another. It might be next week. Want to make sure we talk about Regional Center before we run out of time here for the day. So
Which you have 5 minutes, Megan.
yeah, I'm gonna talk fast. So
we can carry it over to next week if we have to.
Yeah, great. And I think probably we'll get lots of questions about Regional Center, and next week would be a great time to discuss. So we're not going to talk about self-determination today, not because it isn't important, but only because it's its own huge topic. DVU has lots of great resources about self-determination on their website. And what we're going to talk about today is true whether you're in self-determination or in the traditional service model. So some magic words. So the Regional Center is the payer of last resort, which is their fancy way of saying that if you're entitled to something through a generic resource, which is their way of saying anybody else who is supposed to pay, then Regional Center shouldn't be paying. But the caveat is that Regional Center has an obligation to help you actually access those generic resources, right? Which they don't, is the piece that is sometimes missing. So regional centers should be providing services and supports that people need to basically live life the way the rest of us do, right? Go where you want to go, be a part of what you want to be a part of. And they also should make sure that you don't have any gaps in services. That's part of that, payer of last resort role, that they're there to catch needs that fall through the cracks between other services. And so sometimes there's something that you should be able to get through Medi-Cal or school, but you're having trouble accessing it, or it's going to take time and you need it urgently. And so Regional Center can provide what's called gap funding. They like to pretend this doesn't exist, but it does. And so sometimes bringing up that, you really need them to help you avoid a gap in services is the key to getting them to pay for something in the meantime. So with Regional Center, just like with school, you should be asking through a meeting process and getting something written into a document, right? So you have a right to an IPP meeting anytime you want to have one. They have 30 days usually to hold it from when you ask for it. And again, the goals are easy to accidentally skip over because you're focused on the bottom line, which is please pay for this device or this communication support. But the goals really matter because they should be driving all of the services. So get goals written into your IPP, even if you're not yet to the point where regional center agrees that they should pay, right? Because they have an obligation to help you get things from other sources. And if that ends up failing, if your IPP clearly reflects that there's a goal that you need this service for and that it was all agreed that you needed a service from somebody, you're much better set up to then hold regional center accountable to pay for that thing. So it may be a journey to get there, but get those goals in the IPP if you can. So regional center can pay for assessments that may be that you need to prove what you need from another agency. Again, that's part of their role is in helping you access generic resources, which they should be doing. So if they say no, you have a right to a notice of action. And it really helps to ask for things at an IPP meeting so you don't end up in this kind of endless limbo where you sort of informally talked about something with the service coordinator and they said they would get back to you and then they never did. And so you never even got a no. The good thing about asking at an IPP meeting is that even if they say no, if they still say no, at least you finally got a no and you have a timeline for things to happen. So they have to send you that notice of action within 5 days. You have a right to appeal within 30 days of when you get it. And by appealing, you're asking for a hearing in front of an administrative law judge. There are also boxes to check on the form if you want to have either an informal meeting or a mediation to try to resolve the issue with the regional center before a hearing, but you don't have to do either of those things. Now, what if they say yes?
Megan, we're
Sorry.
at 5:29.
Okay, so make sure that it's written in your IPP before you sign. And then if they say yes and put it in your IPP but don't do it, you can file a 4731 complaint. And I'm sure we'll have questions and we can come back to them next week.
Yes, I think we'll pick this up next week, y'all, because we're going to have to end at 5:30 to honor our time restrictions here.
Absolutely. And because it's dinner time.
And it's dinner time too. Yeah. But we will pick this up next week. And these are great conversations. And I'm excited about everybody's involvement. So I'm looking to make this proactive rather than reactive, right? All right. Thank you all for attending. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Thank you.